Hi, and welcome to our weekly One Voice webinar, our COVID-19 update. This is our 8th installment of this weekly series. I'm Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and I am joined today, as always, by my colleagues Paul Nathanson, also at Bracewell, and Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik from the Franklin Partnership. Today's presentation will be available after this webinar on our website, onevoiceinfo.org. There you'll be able to find a recording of this presentation as well as a copy of the slide deck. At that website, you can also find all of the previous webinar recordings and slide presentations. On the website as well, that's onevoiceinfo.org, you can find all or most of the material described in today's webinar, and during the presentation we'll tell you where you can find the different tools and resources that we describe. I also want to flag for you that we will be doing another poll question during today's webinar. For those who were on last week, you'll remember that the poll appears on the screen and you just select your answer. Most people were able to participate in the poll last week, and we hope that other people will participate again this week. That information is very helpful for us on the communication and government relations side as we advocate for you in Washington, D.C., as well as at the state level. So with all of that information in mind, I am going to turn it over to John Guzik with the Franklin Partnership to start this week's update.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thank you very much. And then when one other addition on the poll situation, when the poll question comes up, you're going to have roughly 30 to 45 seconds to answer that poll question. So don't dally around when it pops up. Feel free to take the poll. Those who don't know us, John Guzik. I'm John Guzik, the Franklin Partnership, working with Omar Nashashibi. We are your lobbyists in Washington, not only working on behalf of you under the Capitol Dome, but also with the White House and various federal agencies. What we're going to talk about today is over the past several weeks and months, there's a number of shutdown orders. Well, now we're starting to see many states opening up their operations. And so I want to give you an update on that. We're going to update you on recent additional federal guidelines that came out this week through the CDC and the IRS. We're going to update you on the EIDL, the disaster loan program, which was funded but not operational as recently as last week through the Small Business Administration. Give you an update on the Paycheck Protection Program, and then we're going to talk about the new legislation moving forward that's being developed initially in the House of Representatives and what it might look like for the next phase of Stimulus 3. But Omar, you've done a tremendous job of setting up this new portal so our members can click on their state to see what those new orders are when these states open up.
Yeah, thanks, John. And that's our kudos to our staff and others that have been trying to keep track of it. It does change literally by the hour, and with different states and different counties and cities, as we mentioned in the past, doing different things. Again, this state reopening guide has just been posted again this morning. We're updating it every Tuesday afternoon, every Friday morning. So be sure to check often to see what the latest is in some of your states. Again, we're just going to give a couple of examples each week, just because what we consider what might happen in one state could often drift over into another. So we're not going to go through every state every week, obviously, but last week we did a couple of examples. Here's going to be another 3 or so. What we're suggesting to folks is be sure that when you're looking at your state reopening guidelines, you're not only looking at the general business requirements, but a number of states are also doing special requirements for manufacturers. As you can see here, this is the state of Illinois. While it partners with the other states there in terms of coordinating its reopening date, it does have specific to its state different essential and manufacturing requirements that are there. And so from here, what we suggest folks doing, not just if you're in Illinois, but if you are in other states as well, to start considering, okay, this might be a best practice that some of my customers across the border are doing, or some of my colleagues are. Is this something that might be coming near me as well? Particularly when it comes to requirements of providing PPE that you might need to order in advance to make sure you're in compliance with many of these rules and requirements that go in fairly quickly. And so here's just examples you can see down below on what Illinois was doing. And coming up here is over on Indiana and on Massachusetts. And again, these are constantly changing, and that's why we urge you to keep looking over and over again. What we've done, again, in this guide that you can find on the website, onevoiceinfo.org, state reopening guide. You can go in and it'll provide you a link directly to the governor's order, or in some cases, as we reviewed last week, in Ohio, they've got a posters of what's required, what's suggested. Similarly, they also did what's required in Pennsylvania. In certain areas, they've got posters that you can also download. So we encourage you to make sure that you're looking not just at the CDC requirements that we'll touch on in a little bit, but also what's going on with your requirements. But John, there is a concern about how quickly we can get back up and running, and this is just a survey from the Harbor results. Many of you know Lori Harbor.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, and this is a very telling and very important survey that she said was, and she asked the general shop production and then looked at production shops, how quickly will it take for you as manufacturers to get up and running? And when you look at production shops, it's, in the rate circle, it's 77% of the people polled believe that they can get up and running within 2 weeks. Lori's concerned about that this may be little, overzealous optimism that we're going to get back to work. Because remember, we compete in the global marketplace. And so while things may be opening up here domestically in the States, there are other parts of the world that the COVID virus has not hit its peak, specifically Mexico, and especially those border states in Mexico. And so we have been working with NAM and the U.S. Embassy down there in Mexico to make sure that those guidelines, that the governments of Mexico and everything understand what is happening in the United States, and trying to convince them that to compete in a global marketplace, we all have to be running on the same cylinders, running at the same speed. And as you consider how long it's going to take to get back to and to determine what is that new normal, it may take more than those 2 weeks. And so that is why the CDC came out just this past week with some new guidelines about, the healthy, what are new healthy business guidelines. As we have been saying all along, is know your supply chain. And Omar and I have said in multiple meetings, not only know your supply chain, but know your customers. And not just your customer, but your customer's customer. And then now is the time when it's relatively slow to perhaps consider alternative supply chains moving forward. The CDC suggests even going as far as to maintain critical operations, that you may need to cut back on other work that your shop is doing to maintain critical operations.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about that CDC in a second. I think, though, John, we wanted to shift to see, this was the slide that we're on right now with, let's see if there's a poll. I think, Caitlin, do you mind launching that poll? Let's get a sense of what our members are doing in terms of how quickly they can, or what kind of operational status they have.
Sure. So you should all see a poll question on your screen now. And we're asking about the current status of your operations while these ongoing reopening orders are in effect. We're going to give you just about another 20 seconds or so to complete that poll.
Thank you. And that's helpful as we're giving you the next 20 seconds or so. What we're trying to gauge is, what is the sense of, we're getting questions from Capitol Hill, what are operational status? We've gotten some even worse numbers from some in the automotive industry lately. So that's why we're asking this. So it's helpful. Thanks for that feedback.
Okay, we have almost all the responses in. I'm going to give you just like 3 more seconds, and then I'll show you kind of what the responses have been. So here, let's see these results. Here's where we are, guys.
Thank you, Caitlin. So we've got a little over a third that are at 100% normal operations, for those of you that are dialing by phone. At those that are at 75% of normal operations, they are 28%. 21% of respondents are at 50% of normal operations, with 13% at 25% normal, and 3% are still shut down. So that gives us a sense that a little over a third of our members are fully operational, and about 2/3 are below what they normally would be. So that's helpful. Thanks everybody for that. And that's good information that we'll be able to take to check back. And again, we've been talking to the folks over at the webinar the technical team in case you had some trouble doing the poll. I think part of them, the one excuse they gave us was maybe if you're in full screen mode, that might have an issue with it, but we'll continue to get feedback. We talked to them after last week's, and so we'll double check and make sure the polling was working. So we'll get back to anyone that has trouble there. So thank you, John. I think as you were saying about making sure we've got diverse supply chains, and again, you can imagine that if you got to do this for your customers, or your suppliers rather, your customers are likely doing it for you.
Absolutely. And then as we've seen in the meat industry, where they're essential businesses and they've been making people go back to work, is the CDC is recommending to address the possibility of tremendous absenteeism as your businesses continue to open up, whether it's because there's infections, people are infected, or whether people are scared to come back to work. And so now's the time to prepare your workplace. So for those who are not up to full operations, like our recent survey said, but to start thinking about how we're going to do that. And one of the most important recommendations, and it's relatively common sense, is let's start now thinking about cross-training your employees, so that one person is not the only one responsible in your shop for a given task. And so that to address the issue of absenteeism, that we start preparing now to address those issues.
Thanks, John. And we had a question that, would you tell us how many respondents participated in that poll? Thank you. So we have currently 155 attendees, and we had about a 75% rate. So we had 116 respondents, or say 115 respondents to that poll that responded that 36% are normal operations. So that's how many, and I appreciate that many of you responding. Thank you. As we switch over to a couple of things, we did get a couple of IRS guidance here, and we'll give an update on some lobbying activity. John will touch on what the two chairs are thinking about doing. But on here, we've got a couple of guidance that have come from the IRS. They are really promoting the the employee retention credits, and also looking at this one here dealing with the emergency paid sick leave, and also the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, the fully refundable tax credit, that those of you that are applying for it, they have a quick refund, or an advance payment form. I think you recall 4 or 5 weeks ago, we talked about Form 7200 that you can file. This is their kind of commonly avoid errors that they recently just posted on this Wednesday. Keep in mind also on some of these credits here, the IRS has hit an adverse ruling. One of them is on the employee retention credit. This is when they looked at, what if the employer is continuing to provide health benefits but not providing actual wages? Should that be considering the credit? Should you be able to continue to claim that employee retention credit? So that was a counter. So this is a letter that you'll see here that the U.S. Congress sent to the IRS saying, no, what your action is, your interpretation runs directly counter to the intent that we did up on Capitol Hill. So again, it's just right here, employers who continue providing qualified health benefits, and the IRS interpreted as do not qualify for the retention credit unless they continue paying other qualifying wages. Now, on this one, there is a lobbying effort that's already beginning on Capitol Hill to allow recipients of the 3P loan program to also receive the employee retention credit, because as of right now, the rules do not allow you to do that. You can either claim the retention credit or you can get the 3P. So this is one of those that's getting some attention. But John, getting even more attention is deduction of the wage as an expense.
Yes, and I think we mentioned last week the IRS came out with a rule, guidance that said that if your loan was forgiven, you would not be able to deduct your expenses like payroll. And while many tax professionals thought the IRS interpreted the language in the CARES Act accurately, and the IRS has said if your loan was forgiven, you couldn't deduct it because that would be double dipping. The chairs of the Senate Finance and Ways and Means Committee says, no, our intent when we wrote the legislation was that you would be able to deduct your payroll even if your loan is forgiven. And so here they sent a letter to Secretary Mnuchin asking for clarification. We believe, and we'll get to the next steps of the legislation moving forward, we believe there is pretty broad support within the Congress to make this a legislative fix moving forward in the next package. So.
Yeah, I think John's right. It's pretty bipartisan, and we did hear from a number of you, and yes, we heard you. You heard you loud and clear. The association signed on to a letter yesterday that went up to Capitol Hill this afternoon or yesterday afternoon, stating that you need to fix this. So we are on the record and supporting. There were a few hundred coalition members that were on this, so it's pretty broad and pretty deep in terms of, I think, the push. So we're hopeful we can get this done in the next CARES Act, and John will talk about where we are that in a few slides. But a couple other things that have come up with as we start transitioning to the loan programs that are out there. The Emergency Injury Disaster Loan, the EIDL, EIDL, as many of them on Capitol Hill are calling it. I think they need to come up with a better name for it. That's now coming through even more challenges. It's now open to agriculture only. And that's where many of you recall this was supposed to be giving you your direct $10,000 straight up front with a cap of up to $2 million. The Post reported what many of us had already started hearing the other day, is that they're limiting the SBA, the total loan cap, to 150,000, not even the $2 million as required by Congress. So I think you're going to see, not just with restrictions to the type of businesses, the limitations on the amount of funding, you're going to start seeing increasingly a trend here by SBA and Treasury, I think, to slow things down. I mean, don't you, John, here as we take a look at the 3P Round 2 status, this is some of the latest numbers that have come out.
Yeah, and this is very frustrating for Omar and I, because initially when the CARES Act was developed, there were basically three major pools of money for our manufacturers to utilize. The Paycheck Protection Program, which we're going to talk about in a second, this EIDL program, the Disaster Loan Program, and then through the help of the Feds, the Main Street Lending Program. The PPP was very popular. And so as a result, SBA is concerned, because of the popularity of the PPP program, that that EIDL, the $50 billion that was appropriated in the last stimulus bill, $50 billion for loans and $10 billion for grants, would go away too quickly. And so they have come out, even though it doesn't say this in the legislation, we're only going to give that money to the agriculture industry. So that is concerned. With regard to the PPP program, Omar and I have said over the past couple of weeks, as this program is being developed, that they would run out of money within a week. Well, what SBA and Treasury and IRS they're doing is they're slowing down the distribution of that money. And so we thought the money in the program, they would have run out of money by now, but they haven't. And what this chart shows is that much of the money, which is very large, people who took very large amounts of money and very small amounts of money. And I think that is the intent of Congress. They wanted to make sure that a significant portion of those loans that were dispersed went to the smaller borrowers.
Yeah, as John mentioned, they definitely are trying to slow things down up there. And most importantly, I think what the questions that we continue to receive is, what's going on with it? Are they going to do another round? That's kind of what we need to start hearing from you all. Is it enough? And we'll talk about some of the things we're lobbying to try to fix it in a few slides. But the biggest question we've gotten in the last several days is, tell us about the audit, tell us about the Los Angeles Laker effect, Shake Shack, tell us about the ability to have liquidity and some of the other issues. So we'll talk here quickly about what we think we do know. Here's on the positive side. The forgiveness, we don't have full guidance yet, but we have seen the scenario come up in large part, and not large part, but sometimes due because of the new unemployment insurance, $600 extra that they are provided. What happens if you offer to rehire an employee that does not return? So for that, how does that affect your forgiveness headcount? Why should you be penalized? That's something that we've been raising. So let's look at the scenario that they've got here. You have offered to rehire, you have made a good faith written offer of rehire to that employee, and the employee rejection of that offer is documented by you, the borrower of the 3P. So the reason this is important is because your FTE and your headcount, looking at your payroll from the time you took the loan through June 30th will be counted. So if you reduce it, as we've discussed in the past, reduce your FTE amount below at least 75%, then they're going to start reducing the amount of forgiveness that is provided, and the rest of it converts into the loan portion at 1%. So that's why this is important to keep track of, that if you do hire somebody back and you offer to hire someone back and they refuse, or they've moved on to another type of employment, then you need to document that, and so it doesn't count against your FTE count when you turn in your forgiveness request at the end of the 8 weeks. But again, good faith effort. Everything that we talk about here is always going to be about good faith. And this one, before we jump into federal government enforcement, this is also about the what we call the safe harbor provision that they provided. I think you all recall that they had May 7th as the previous deadline, Thursday, for businesses to return the loans if they felt that they were publicly traded and they had other access to liquidity. Question 37, however, on April 28th, also extended the answer of question 31 to affect also private businesses. So this is what we're still waiting the guidance. They have told us that this amount, if you want to return it, or you weren't sure if your certification your request was necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. So if you are concerned you do not meet that requirement, you have until May 14th to return it. Personally, that's not the provision that I have as much concern about. The other one I concern more about is the access to liquidity. Some of the attorneys with whom we've spoken to have said no, the personal savings of owners are not going to be counted as having access to liquidity. That's not the issue right now that they're going to be focused on. It's more of how big is your rainy day fund, how large was your existing line of credit. These are some of the things that lawyers, at least right now, are speculating on until we get additional guidance that comes in from the Department of Treasury and SBA. But at least they've now told us that no later than May 14th, that they will have this. Our gut tells us Sunday. They tend to do a lot of these. The last 2 Sundays in a row, we've gotten pretty substantive FAQ answers. So we're hoping to get some more guidance on the forgiveness this weekend and whether or not folks return the loans. But John, there is a lot of enforcement that's going on, Justice, SBA, Treasury, all of them.
Yeah, just look at the slide. We got the Justice Department, Treasury Department, Small Business Administration, Inspector General, all investigating to make sure that they're following the rules of law. And so that's why we've been reiterating over the past several weeks that make sure that you as borrowers have your documentation in place. In years past, when you got an SBA loan, it was the lender who's on the hook if something went bad with the loan application. Well, to move this money out quickly, they reverse the responsibility to not from the lender but to the borrower to make sure that they have everything in order. Furthermore, Senators Schumer, Cardin, and Sherrod Brown have asked for a study to make sure that the money that's gone out has met the criteria set forth in the CARES Act, in the stimulus bills. Typically, a study like this is going to take roughly 90 days. They have asked for a flash report, and we expect that relatively quickly on the initial look, is this moving forward? So they're not only looking at to make sure that Treasury and IRS and SBA is moving the money out to the right places. They want to make sure it's not going out to the next version of the LA Lakers or Ruth Chris or anything like that. But they're also looking at to make sure that the borrowers are using the money appropriately. And for example, the Department of Labor has already ruled against a California business who refused to provide sick leave to their employee, even though they had a written note from the doctor that because of the COVID virus that they should be quarantined. And so they're going to be looking at it from both sides of the perspective. We have said week after week to make sure your all your records are documented. If you receive the PPP loan, we recommended you put it in a separate account, so it's a separate bank account, so it's clearly recorded of the money going in, the money going out of that account.
Yeah, what we also are suggesting, again, not legal advice, but based on just conversations with others, I think John sent it a couple of times this week and then the previous one, is you want to look at your good faith effort and document. So you want to effectively document your good faith effort. We suggest that we have a question here that, do we know if loans under $2 million will definitely not be audited? We heard the advice from one lender to the borrower that came to us. They said anybody over 1 million should just to be safe, consider documenting. It's always good whenever you're dealing with any kind of loan, as you all know, to document anyway if expenses are restricted in terms of that loan structure. So yes, we would suggest things that include a memo to file. The further you get away from the dates you had these conversations, the harder it'll be to recreate them. So we are suggesting that you do look at any emails between the owners and the executives and staff on why the loan was needed. What did the loan help prevent? Any layoffs, keeping people employed, any communications from your customers saying that they were delaying any shipments or delaying orders and payments. Those are the kinds of things that potentially we've heard might be looked for. But again, we don't have that information until we get the exact documentation on the guidance in which we are still awaiting. While we're on this, we've got 2 other questions related to the guidance, of which we'll probably also give the same answer. One was, will health insurance premiums still be forgiven for a laid off employee where the workload does not warrant calling them back? And so again, that's something that we're going to have to wait for the guidance with regards to what Treasury and SBA says. We just don't have that level of detail based on any of the FAQs that they've released so far. And we've got quite a few answers. We just hit about 50 or so, but we still don't have that one. That's a little bit too unique and similar to some of those that are of voluntary separations. And how do you deal with the count against forgiveness was another question. And what we would suggest in that one, until we do have guidance, is you keep track of making sure that simple way to break it down, it's an expense that occurred within that 8-week period. So the 8-week period again begins on the date the funds were deposited in your account. So that's when the clock starts. And so anything that's been incurred during those periods. So we had a question several weeks ago about I prepay my employee benefits for that month, or at the end of the year, I pay out all the retirements. It would not fall within that covered 8-week period. Likely the final interpretation will remain that it cannot be forgiven because it did not come within that 8-week period that's out there as well. So those are what we believe, we think we know. Again, it's not too late. We had a question, is it too late to apply for the 3P program loan? There's still a good amount of money, at least about 30 to 40% of the funds are still remaining in the 3P loan account. So yes, still we urge you to contact your lenders. But John, there are some steps up on Capitol Hill. You've got Senators Bennett, Democrat of Colorado, and Todd Young, Republican of Indiana, trying to address the 8 weeks issues many of you have concerns about.
Yeah, we've heard loud and clear after the last few webinars is that this 8-week period is not real. It needs an extension. I mean, people are paying. We got manufacturers paying these employees to basically stay at home and not work because there's not enough work to do. Yet after the 8 weeks is up, they're going to be forced to lay them off because their work is still not there. And so Senators Bennett and Young, among others, are looking at what to do. And so specifically, I mean, so this is just one legislative proposal. There are many out there, but for non-publicly traded companies, you would be able to extend your PPP from 8 to 16 weeks. That allow you to spend down any future PPP money if you haven't spent it down already, but also provide some loan forgiveness. Other proposals that are out there, if you're from New York City or Los Angeles, high rent districts, there are those who believe the 75-25 ratio, where you have 75% of your PPP loan must be used for payroll and 25% for mortgage, interest, rent, utilities, et cetera, that they wanted to change that ratio from 75-25 to as much as 50-50. So those are just two examples. The next slide is another example of a larger, more broad-based possible resolution to restart the economy, restart manufacturing, and get people back to work. Having said all this, the legislation is being crafted by Nancy Pelosi and her lieutenants. The previous two stimulus bills were written in the United States Senate. Speaker Pelosi would love the House to come back next week and vote on this proposal moving forward. This is, Omar and I try to be balanced in describing legislative proposals because we know there's some good things and some bad things in everything. But this proposal put forth by Speaker Pelosi, and again, it's just a draft and it's still yet to change, has some good things. We'll extend the PPP. We anticipate it'll extend the PPP. It'll make some minor changes, which is good. But it'll also include state and local funding, which Senate Republicans have great concerns with. It provides additional money for healthcare screening and testing, money for the for elections, for the upcoming elections, to provide additional money for mail-in ballots, funding for the United States Postal Service, and even they go after the fossil fuel industry. If you extract, refine, store, or export natural gas or coal, you're not eligible for the PPP program. And so these are just some examples that we are hearing that is going to be included in this package. We anticipate the House will pass something substantially similar to this, probably not next week, but the following week. But then the question is, it goes on to the Senate and what happens there. And Omar, I don't know what you think, but I think this is a provision that's probably dead on arrival in the Senate. The question is how much political pressure will be put on those senators who don't like the additional money for state and local governments and don't like, yelling out the Postal Service and the fossil fuel provisions. How much is Speaker Pelosi going to fall on the sword to protect those specific provisions versus moving forward with the next stimulus bill? So yet to be seen. Omar, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I do think ultimately the Republicans will have to provide some money because it's not just about punishing states that, the old Illinois adage and things like that. I mean, California was a budget surplus, Jersey budget surplus. Now their unemployment insurance was underfunded in Texas, California, and elsewhere as well, obviously. But many of the states that we typically think are the blue states, those that are mismanaging their funds, most of them actually had surpluses in the last several years. The problem is you take a look at a state like California that's looking at just total collapse in terms of the tax intake that's coming in from them. And in areas like that, that's where you're going to have to see services start to be reduced over time over the next several years if these folks don't get their funding. And so I think you've already started to see a bipartisan effort over on the Senate side to start at least giving them $500 billion. A bill is going to be introduced on Tuesday to address that issue. But from our standpoint, I think the big question is what happens with the 3P program? Is there an extension? We do know that there is an effort that people do want to at least make fixes. We're in the process of drafting recommendations in terms of what we want to see changed and what we want to see fixed with regards to the challenges that John addressed on previous slides that are out there. So again, I don't know if that gets done by Memorial Day at this point. I think I agree with John. We might slip here into June for a bit. But again, Pelosi's got to start somewhere. She's got the advantage of being able to get her whole caucus, looks like, to fall behind her. This won't likely pass and go anywhere, but you got to start somewhere in negotiations. And that's where we think we are. But as we're getting a little bit past the half-hour mark here, I want to throw it over to the folks at Bracewell to kind of start carrying it through.
Yeah, sure. Very quickly this week, this is Paul. We continue to have a lot of attention in the media and a lot of inquiries, particularly as Omar and John are lobbying on these bills that will be coming up. It will be important to get the perspective from on the ground, so we'll be reaching out to you, some of you as always, with reporters from the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, AP, Washington Post. So there's plenty of opportunities. And the more media volunteers we have, the better. This week we did put out a press release just reminding folks about the good things that are happening in our industry and the great things that you're doing to help your communities and the country. We wanted to advertise a little bit the page that we've put up on the onevoiceinfo.org site that promotes the things that both NTMA and PMA members are doing. So we sent this release to our list of about several hundred manufacturing reporters just to remind them of the great things that you're doing.
And if you are interested in reading these member stories, you can find them on the One Voice Info website, right on the homepage, Members Making a Difference. You can click through that and read the many stories on the website. I think we're over 20 stories now, so much appreciation to both associations who are gathering those stories, getting them to us. Some members have sent them to us directly. That's great. A couple of people contacted me after last week's webinar and said, hey, my story isn't up yet, or I can't find the stories. We've added lots over the weekend and then all of this week. So do check back, find it there. And also on the website are all the other tools and resources that have been described on the call. And if you haven't gotten enough of us yet and you want more information, you can always find us on our Talking with One Voice podcast. You can find the link to that at the bottom of the One Voice Info website, as well as on any podcast platform. There's more information there, as well as on social media where you can follow us at One Voice for MFG. So many places to find our content and to find member stories.
Thank you. And with that, we're at 12:35 Eastern, so we just want to answer a couple of quick questions that have come in recently. If you'd like a reminder, as John mentioned earlier, you can type a question over on the box on the right-hand side and hit send, and we're taking a look at them here. So one of them is that we just got in: eligible expenses for 3P, should we use cash or accrual basis? So we do need more guidance on that. The guidance right now only says, quote, payments. So it discusses payments, but we definitely are going to need further clarification. We are looking also at the Association International CPAs, and that's what they've also put up as well. So we don't have an answer yet on cash or accrual. So we do need to still continue to wait for that forgiveness guidance. And I know we sound like a broken record since we keep saying that every week, but that's literally what everyone in business is waiting for right now. And unfortunately, that's the same question that we also got, what is meant by alternate sources of loan money. I think what the phrasing that they initially had was access to liquidity, and that was initially rather intended for the publicly traded, not as much the privates, but the way that they did the FAQs on questions 31 and 37, they ended up referencing the private owned back to the way it was written for the publicly traded. So we do need to wait a little bit more guidance to see exactly what they mean by that access to liquidity, if it was truly just intended for the publicly traded or could be extended to the privates as well. So we'll hopefully get a better sense here in the next couple of days when we get that guidance that they promised us, and that by May 14th. Any other questions?
We promised to have a future webinar where we don't use the term we are waiting for more guidance.
Yeah, no kidding. But believe it or not, folks, this is actually very fast for government work in terms of how they've been able to do this. And that's part of the problems. They keep changing the rules underneath you. And we definitely have heard your frustration in many phone calls and emails, and we've gotten that up to Capitol Hill. With that, not seeing any more questions, thank you all very much. We'll continue doing these webinars. Stay tuned for later updates. Please check back, onevoiceinfo.org. We'll talk next Friday, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. Thank you very much.